c'est pour chercher et trouver le soutien de l'opinion publique. Arsène Lupin a toujours le soutien de l'opinion publique. Or, pour avoir le soutien de l'opinion publique, eh bien, il faut paraître juste. Il faut être juste. Évidemment, si Lupin tuait, il n'aurait pas le soutien de l'opinion publique. Or, Lupin ne tue pas. Il cambriole. Quand il cambriole ou quand il ridiculise la police, il a le soutien de la police, il a le soutien de l'opinion publique. C'est-à-dire quelque part que l'opinion publique a son héros, et ce héros-là, eh bien, elle espère qu'il va lui présenter une nouvelle forme de société, peut-être, une nouvelle forme de rapports sociaux, une nouvelle forme de structuration normée, quelque part, avec des règles nouvelles établies par Lupin pour le bien de tous. C'est le mythe du héros sauveur de l'humanité, c'est le mythe qu'on rencontre dans tant de fiction et tant de bandes dessinées aujourd'hui, de Superman avec tant de super pouvoirs qui va sauver l'humanité. Arsène Lupin, quelque part, en est déjà un. Et ce qui frappe le plus, c'est cette utilisation de l'opinion publique, parce que l'opinion publique, selon Maurice Leblanc, elle a du bon sens. Et ce bon sens, c'est celui, finalement, de réussir à trouver la justice malgré les institutions, malgré les institutions qui sont là pour défendre un ordre bourgeois, établi, ancien et parfois très injuste. Et il y a une glorification certaine de l'opinion publique. Alors l'opinion publique, il y a le rapport avec le droit naturel, mais Arsène Lupin nous ouvre la voie de l'explication. Le droit naturel, au sens lupinien, si je puis dire, c'est pas Dieu du tout. Arsène Lupin le dit très clairement, Dieu, ce sont des superstitions. Il n'est pas méchant avec le clergé, le bon clergé, les bons curés dans son œuvre sont très sympas. De temps en temps, il porte même volontiers la soutane quand ça l'arrange pour rentrer dans les trésors, dans les cryptes où il y a quelque chose à prendre. Mais il n'y a pas de dénonciation de l'Église. Pour lui, l'Église, ça appartient au passé. Elle appartient au passé. Ce sont les anciennes superstitions. Et donc, comment Lupin peut nous permettre d'approcher une certaine conception de la justice tout en balayant l'idée de Dieu? Eh bien, c'est avec l'opinion publique, le bon peuple, qui aurait la science infuse, ou en tout cas la perception infuse de l'idée de justice. Et cette idée de justice, eh bien, il faut que les politiques, il faut que ceux qui ont en charge de faire des lois, eh bien, essayent de s'en inspirer pour pouvoir établir un ordre social finalement beaucoup plus juste. Voilà un peu pourquoi je suis parti sur l'idée que Arsène Lupin, de anti-héros du droit positif, était un vrai héros du droit naturel. Bien entendu, il y a dans nos propos une sorte d'escroquerie intellectuelle, mais ça, c'est nécessaire quand on a la charge de présenter un tel auteur. Il faut bien essayer de passer pour ce que l'on n'est pas. Voilà. Je vous remercie.
Bien, pasamos a la última intervención en esta mesa y yo quisiera decirles que la profesora María Aristomedo es una de las referencias precursoras del movimiento de Derecho y Literatura en Europa. El primer libro, prácticamente inencontrable, es del año 2000. Y ahora nos introduce en una nueva intersección, derecho, literatura y psicoanálisis. Yo quiero ponerle de relieve algo, pretender en absoluto invadir el terreno. Esta relación entre derecho y psicoanálisis es proyectada en la figura de Lacan, pero mucho más antigua. Está en Kelsen. Kelsen mantiene una polémica en la que encuentra coincidencias y también puntos de con Freud el año 1919. Teoría del Estado incorpora el concepto de líquido. Y esto sugiere la idea de quizá un nuevo horizonte en las relaciones de investigación entre derecho y literatura. Y ese nuevo horizonte está en lo que a mí me parece que podría llamarse un giro hacia el afecto. Affective tour. Y en esto los juristas tenemos una formación muy precaria. En general, las ciencias sociales, respecto del concepto de afecto, de líbido, psicoanálisis. Simplemente poner esto de manifiesto y ceder la palabra, muy satisfecho de hacerlo, sobre el espacio.
Muchas gracias. Okay, we are lost in translation here. There's so many languages. I apologize that I'm going to talk in English. My French is not as good as I'd like it to be. I mean, the French language is like my object of desire. I've always shied away from it because I always thought it was far too beautiful for me to ever learn. So I can only get bits of it. And I wanted to start by thanking Sophie and Pascal for inviting me, and Laura doing all this running around. But whilst I was sitting here today listening to you, I started thinking, should I be thanking them, or is this a cruel joke? I mean, I'm thinking, that normally when I go to a conference, I listen to what people have to say, and I'm able to engage and respond and, give my paper in response to what has already gone. And now, as if my nature is not hysterical enough, I'm already doubly hystericized because I'm not quite sure what people are saying. I don't know the desire of the other. So I'm even more at loss. But at the same time, it might be a lesson for me, because what I am going to preach today, what I'm going to put forward, is a state of discipline and for the individual that I myself haven't reached yet, as you can see. Otherwise, I wouldn't be so hysterical about not being able to understand everything. But it's a state that I call a sort of atheist law and literature. It's the sort of state that ideally the ethical subject will reach when they don't care about the desire of the other. They realize that the other doesn't exist, or that there is no other of the other, that there is, that every discipline, in some respects, in all respects, is already castrated, and therefore we shouldn't be worried about putting ourselves forward towards the other, or trying to marry ourselves with other disciplines. But it's not a state I've reached yet, so maybe at the end of my paper I will be able to convince myself as well as you. So what I'm going to do is to go over a little bit of my own background in law and literature. As Jose said, I started, apparently, I didn't know that at the time, but apparently it was the first law and literature course in the UK. Unfortunately, this would give away my age, but it was in 1994, so it's already 2 decades ago. And it was the first time, in a UK law school, the two disciplines have been put together. And since then, what I've witnessed, and I'm sure you probably all witnessed as well in Europe and in the States, the discipline is proliferating. We don't have just law and literature now. We have law in literature, we have law as literature, we have law of literature, we have literature as law, which is the one I focused on. And my worry, or what I'm going to focus on here is, has it made any difference? Has it made any difference in anybody, in the individual or in the subject? Has it made any difference to the law? I mean, what I'm worried about, and this is reimagining the end of the book that Jose mentioned, is, was I too enthusiastic and too positive about marrying law and literature as I did about 15 years ago in that book? The idea there, I don't know if people are familiar with the thesis I put forward, was that, I sort of almost aligned law as the sort of masculine fortress that tried to keep its own fortress well protected and strong. And in order to do that, it ended up excluding other people, most particularly in the case I was discussing 15 years ago, was women. And I was hoping that literature, by whom I anthropomorphize as a sort of on the feminine side of the formula of sexuation, would actually be enabled to get in the legal labyrinth and not only allow a space for women, but also rescue the legal labyrinth from its own loneliness, its own boredom, its own stuckness. Yeah? That was the idea, and I thought, by marrying law and literature, we would achieve much more for the so-called other than law by itself. Now, the news I have, or I came to come to terms with, was that the marriage between law and literature wasn't as happy as I expected. It would have been in 2000, probably ended in divorce, the children are in therapy. So the question is really what went wrong. And my suggestion now is that what was happening, and maybe it's still happening, I've just been to the States and I saw some people addressing law and literature from this point of view, which I think is quite a reactionary point of view. But what seems to happen, I think, is that law looks to literature in order to find in literature what is missing in law. Now, what that ends up, the danger of that, I suggest, and I use Lacan to illustrate that, but also psychoanalysis, is that it goes back to any relationship, whether it's between two disciplines or between two people. The idea is that if you are in a relationship with someone, whether it's another discipline or another person, and you are expecting the other person to make up for your own lack, for what is problematic with you, you're inevitably going to be disappointed, but also you're going to mutilate, as Lacan says, the other person. So that's one of the problems. You end up expecting too much from literature and turning literature into something it is not. Meanwhile, the other danger of this trying to marry law with literature is that you end up doing nothing about law itself. In the same way, like Lacan says, when you're in a relationship with the other person, if you expect the other person to complete you, you enable yourself to continue to misunderstand what is wrong with you. And therefore, all the burden goes on the other person. And I don't need to preach Lacan to you, all know Lacan, but in the analysis, I think what we have to come to terms with, that there is no such thing as a sexual relationship, whether it's between law and literature or between one human being and another. And what we have to come to terms with is the lack, both in law and the lack in literature. And it dawned on me actually that for my new book, it was only last night I thought of it, what I should have called this new book is not law and psychoanalysis or law and literature and psychoanalysis, but law castrated. In other words, that all disciplines, whether it's law, whether it's literature, or law and literature, are always already castrated, and we shouldn't be expecting to make them whole by marrying them with each other. So what is the better way of approaching it that I've come to rely on in my older age anyway? What I do now is more focus on literature as law's analyst, but not any old analyst, not the, and this is the example I'm going to illustrate today. It's the nasty Lacanian analyst that I hope I will be addressing law with. In other words, and I will illustrate it with an example that Lacan used, and I don't want our analysis of law by literature to end up into this sort of Californian eco-psychology, which ends up telling the law that it's actually okay, you don't have to worry about it, or which ends up making law adjust to reality, makes law normalize law, yeah? So the danger of trying to analyze law is if you end up with an eco-psychology kind of analyst, what you end up doing is telling law, you're okay, you don't have to worry too much, and enabling law to adapt to reality, and therefore life continues as normal. So what we want is not an eco-psychology sort of American analyst, or not a bad version of Freud, but a Lacanian analyst that actually devastates the subject, that actually destroys the subject and creates another subject anew. Yeah, one that leads to a rebirth, a new subject altogether. That would be the analysis that would be worth doing. Okay, so in order to illustrate this, I'm going to look at a case that Lacan kept coming back to for ages, for too long in some respects, because I don't know, I mean, you know your Lacan better than me, but he found a flaw in an American analyst's way of dealing with the patient, and because he enjoyed taking the piece and making the American analyst look stupid, he kept going back to it. I mean, he came across this case from his first seminar in 1953 and didn't let it go until 1964. And every few months, every few years, he brings it back and basically ridicules the American analyst. And what is it that Lacan finds problematic? Basically, I mean, to summarize now here, and then I will give you an outline of the case, of the clinical case, is that Lacan thinks the problem with the eco-psychology and the case that this American analyst looked at basically stayed, according to Lacan, on the level of the imaginary. That it basically stayed on the level of the patient's ego. And this is the lesson I take when we are hopefully analyzing law with the means of literature. The danger is that we should not stay at the level of the law's ego. What we should do, and what Lacan indicates should have been done in this particular case, is try to penetrate to the patient's, or in our case, law's, estimate desires. Are you all familiar with the term estimate? Because it's a Lacanian neologism. But basically, for a Lacanian analysis, you don't just stay on the level of the symbolic, let alone the level of the imaginary, because as you all know, the imaginary is fake, it's a misrecognition. So you don't stay at the level of the patient's ego. You don't take at face value what the patient tells you about themselves. So if the law says, I'm like this, I'm like that, the analyst must shake their head and say, just completely ignore it, because the patient's own understanding of themselves is ultimately going to be a misrecognition. So what you want to find as an analyst is the truth behind the patient's empty speech, behind their misrecognition. And as you know, that truth is inevitably going to be ugly. I mean, Lacan calls it the estimate. He says it's something that is so, at least the English translation is estimate. In French, I think it's estimité. Jacques-Alain Miller writes about it very beautifully. But the idea is that what you want to penetrate to is that part of the patient's desire which is not only intimate, it's not only really, really intimate, so intimate that they have hidden in the innermost recesses of their unconscious, but they have excluded it in the interior. Even in the interior, they have excluded it. Okay, so that's why it's called the estimate. It's like a combination of the exclusion on the inside. So if it's excluded on the interior, it's very unusual. It's very hard for us to get, to penetrate to it. Nevertheless, for any good analysis to take place, you have to penetrate to the estimate. Either you stay at the level of the imaginary, and we won't make the difference to the law, to the patient. And this is, I'll give you the example that Lacan gives in order to show you what is different, how Lacan would have done things differently, and how eco-psychology that I'm warning against can go wrong. I mean, okay, and it's called, I don't know if people have come across it before, it's called the fresh brains case. Fresh brains, what it is literal as well as metaphorical, yeah? You know what fresh brains means, but you can actually eat fresh brains, yeah? But also fresh brains in terms of new ideas. Anyway, it's a case that of a patient analyzed by Ernst Kries, who was one of Freud's disciples, who, like Freud himself, but like many other people, left Vienna before the Second World War because of the persecution of Jewish people. And some of them, like Freud, ended up in England. Triumvirate, the troika of psychologists, Freudian psychologists, ended up in New York, and Ernst Kries was one of the three. And this is a case of a patient that Ernst Kries analyzed in 1950s New York. And it's quite interesting. I mean, how is it from, because he was an academic. The patient was an academic like us, and his symptom, for which he sought analysis with Ernst Kries, was that despite the fact that he was an academic, he couldn't publish anything. He could never bring himself to write anything. So even though he was doing research, he would never get around to actually publishing anything. And as you know, if you don't publish, it's not good for your academic career. So he goes to analysis partly to address this symptom. And the thing is, what do they find out in the course of the analysis is that the patient is not plagued by normal doubts, like we all are, that his work is not good enough. That's not what's preventing him from publishing. His symptom is that he's convinced, every time he comes up with a thesis, with an idea, he is convinced that that idea has already been said, but not only that, that he has copied it from someone who has already said it. So in other words, his symptom is that he always believes he's a plagiarist. So because he's a plagiarist, he can't possibly publish anything. So Kries has to sort of address this symptom and find out, what is inhibiting him from publishing anything. Why the hell does he think he's a plagiarist every time he comes up with anything? So it's a lot of sessions, a lot of analysis. Eventually, one day, the patient comes into Kries's smart apartment in New York and says, "Oh my God, I think I've come across with a new idea. I'm going to publish it." He's really excited about this new idea that he's going to publish. Kries thinks the analysis is working, except the following session, the next week, the patient again comes back and says, "Oh my God, sorry, it was all false alarm. I thought it was a new idea. I thought no one had mentioned it, but actually I checked the library. There is a thesis in the library that says the same thing, and I must have read the thesis because it was published 10 years ago, so I'm still a plagiarist. So I can't publish anything." Now, when Kries is listening to his patient telling him he's a plagiarist again, he notices that his patient is actually very excited to have discovered himself a plagiarist. He's not upset. He says, "Oh, I am a plagiarist, so I can't publish it." So Kries is really frustrated. The analyst was frustrated because his patient is still not able to move forward. So Kries does what Lacan says is unforgivable. What Kries does, and it's not clear if Kries has actually done that, but that is how Lacan presents it in his retelling of the story. Kries, in his resume of the story in the International Psychoanalytic Journal, he says, after extended scrutiny, in other words, Kries went out to find out if the patient's thesis, he actually asked him, "What is your thesis?" He asked him, "What is the other guy's thesis?" Then Kries himself went to the library, according to Lacan, but Kries doesn't say that, to check if the two theses were identical. And having, Kries satisfied himself that his patient's thesis was not a copy of the old thesis. So the next time the patient comes, he announces to him, "You think you are a plagiarist? Don't worry, I've gone and checked, you are not a plagiarist, so you can publish it." And Lacan says that's absolutely ridiculous. This is the last thing the analyst should have done. The analyst should never, because what Kries did, and he's an idiot, that's probably to Lacan, because he needs fresh brains, in other words, that's why, I'll tell you why it's called fresh brains. He entered the case, the analysis, at the level of the patient's imaginary. at the level of the patient's ego. So the patient thinks he's a plagiarist. The analyst says, oh, I went and checked, you're not a plagiarist, so we're both happy. So basically, the analyst here did the patient's homework. He actually went and checked about the project the patient was working on and found out it was not a plagiarism. You could go along and publish it. Having done his patient's homework, Chris did his own homework as an analyst and came up with an explanation to Chris as to why explanation to his patient as to why he was hampered by this symptom that he thought was always a plagiarism. And the explanation, the interpretation that Chris comes up with, which Lacan actually doesn't have a problem with this interpretation. The explanation is that the patient happened to have a grandfather who was grand in the sense that he had been a really famous scientist and he had always published original work and he was feted for his originality and his... So, according to Chris, the patient's symptom was that he was too scared to compete with his grandpair and he was using the excuse of plagiarism as a defense against having to compete with a father who is the grandpair. Yeah? So the defense of plagiarism suited the patient very well because it meant that he never had to enter the good old-fashioned Oedipus struggle. Yeah? It was like the old-fashioned Oedipus struggle, according to Chris. And that's fine. That interpretation doesn't bother Lacan, and maybe that was the problem. But Lacan is really annoyed that the analyst went out and found out for himself and told the patient that he is not a plagiarist. So he said to him, yeah, like I just said, he says to him, I checked in the library, you are not a plagiarist, go and publish it. It sounds really good, sounds like the analysis has worked, except the patient, as he's leaving the session, just like all of us, when we leave the most important things to say at the very last minute, as we leave the session, So the patient, as he's about to leave the session, he turns to Chris and says, you know, every time I leave your apartment, I try and go for lunch, and I go to this particular street in New York. It's a little street full of bijou, exquisite restaurants, and I look at the menus for all of those restaurants, and I choose the restaurant that has my preferred dish, and my preferred dish is fresh brains. So basically here what Lacan, and I hope it's obvious, basically the patient who is told you are not a plagiarist, you have fresh brains of your own, go and publish your fresh brain ideas, having been told he's not a plagiarist, goes off to the restaurant and eats fresh brains. In other words, the treatment has not worked. He's still acting out, yeah? And this is precisely, I think the problem is when we address the patient at the level of their own ego, rather than penetrate to their extimate desires and to the ugly things, then we're not treating them. They are going to act out and they're going to go off looking for fresh brains. So the treatment will not have worked. So what should the analyst, a good analyst like us, like Lacan, would have done? Well, I mean, Lacan's problem with this kind of analysis is that what it ends up doing is it ends up making the patient in the image of the analyst. If you enter, if you are a literature scholar entering law on the level of the law's ego, then you end up treating literature as if it's a bit of law, and vice versa, and law as if it's a bit of literature. What you need to do is enter the estimate regions of both law and literature. And in the final analysis, come to terms with the fact that neither law nor literature are going to be able to offer, offer the answers to any of our, there's always going to be a gap. So that's why this book should have been called like castrated disciplines rather than, and basically in order for us to get to the, what if had the analyst, Chris in that particular case, not entered into, the patient's imaginary, to the patient's ego, and try to tell them, the plagiarists, don't worry. What they would have found out had they persevered with the treatment properly, they would have found out why the patient was so hungry for fresh brains in the first place. I mean, Lacan gives the example of the anorexic patient in the same way. You can't go, if you have an anorexic patient, you don't tell them, there's food, eat it. You actually find out why they are, what their desire for nothing consists of. You actually find out that there is an enjoyment in desiring nothingness. But if you satisfy the desire for nothingness by in the way that the analyst Chris did in this case, then you never find out why they want nothingness, where the desire comes from. And if you do penetrate to the excess, I mean, like I said, I mean, I call it like an atheist sort of law and literature project, because what ideally we should come up with at the end is to kill both the analyst and the object of analysis. In other words, we should come up, we should be at home with the idea that neither know literature, know everything, that we should be at home with our own lack of knowledge, including my own lack of knowledge of French. And at that point, I call it the atheist law and literature, because we wouldn't rely on a big other that will bring us all together, and we would be able to sort of marry the two in a happily ever after conclusion. And what it also allows us to do, and I don't know, I mean, in England in particular, is when you penetrate to these extremate desires, you find all the ugly, obscene underside, as well as violent underside of both law and of literature. I mean, I don't know, I mean, the examples multiply in England at the moment, for instance. There's so many obvious examples of the obscene underside of our legal system. I mean, the legal and political system. It's just out there in the open now. You have all these the scandals in Westminster, which we thought it was just expensive scandals. Now it's a pedophile ring, not just a pedophile ring, a ring that colluded and allowed the sort of the covering up of murder in this pedophile ring. So, and Mrs. Thatcher and a whole list of establishment figures were in cognizance of that, and were never even, it never came to the surface. And the idea here is that if you do, if you penetrate to this extimacy, to this extimate desires of both the legal system, you will find these ugly recesses that most people don't want to come across, pretend they don't exist. But unless you get to those ugly bits, then the analysis will never end. It will be like with Chris's patient, where the analysis, Chris thinks the patient has been cured, and then the patient goes out in search of fresh brains. So he's still acting out. So in order for a complete cure, you actually have to penetrate to the extimate recesses. Okay.
Intervenciones dirigidas a la mesa, aunque por la mesa han pasado más intervinientes. ¿Hay alguien que desea hacer alguna pregunta a los miembros de la mesa?
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans la salle? Est-ce que pour notre camarade Bruno. Dans ton analyse de Lupin, tu nous dépeins une ontologie du droit mise en place sur finalement le phénomène de transgression. Tu nous parles de Lupin en tant que figure du droit qui construit le droit sur la base de la transgression. La question en t'écoutant est la suivante. Est-ce que finalement le juriste ne serait pas prisonnier de deux figures? La question étant de savoir laquelle tu préfères et si c'est finalement deux figures qui sont un peu l'éthique qu'une autre, est-ce qu'il y a des solutions? Est-ce que finalement on n'est pas condamné à être soit un autiste à l'égard du droit, c'est-à-dire à accepter le droit pour ce qu'il est sans avoir à le questionner, c'est-à-dire simplement une sorte d'autiste général qui applique le droit sans se refusant à le penser? La figure opposée, ça serait celle que tu as dépeint, du bandit grand chemin, partant de l'idée que le bandit est toujours à la marge du chemin en question, il attend criant. Alors est-ce qu'on est prisonnier de cette antinomie? Est-ce qu'on est obligé d'être soit autiste, soit brillant?
J'aimerais te faire une réponse lacanienne, mais je suis un peu démuni là maintenant. Ta question, de toute façon, induit la réponse. On ne peut pas supporter d'être autiste devant le droit. En réalité, Lupin, comme j'essaie de le démontrer, déconstruit le droit en permanence. C'est plutôt une lecture à la Derrida qu'une lecture à la Lacan. Il déconstruit le droit parce que le droit n'est pas suffisant pour apporter satisfaction. Et donc dans cette déconstruction, lui, il ressent une certaine jouissance. Nous aussi, on peut la ressentir. Et seulement après, il faut reconstruire quelque chose. Mais comme la nature a horreur du vide, l'ordre social se rétablit toujours. Et donc l'essentiel, finalement, est plus la déconstruction que la reconstruction. En tout cas, je pense que c'est au moins la mission noble de la littérature, de tout aider à la déconstruction, à la reconstruction. Elle viendra peut-être avec une opinion publique éclairée, peut-être par des étapes de populisme, comme on assiste actuellement à cette évolution. Je crois que le droit est appelé à être déconstruit en permanence et à être reconstruit avec toute la meilleure volonté du monde, mais malheureusement en privilégiant toujours ceux qui tirent le mieux leur épingle du jeu, c'est-à-dire ceux qui sont les dominants. Je crois qu'il y a une autre issue possible, sauf à ce que les dominants puissent avoir une bonne figure, acceptée par le plus grand nombre de personnes possible, et à condition que ce plus grand nombre soit le plus éclairé possible.
Oui.
Monsieur Basson, vous avez...
Oui, je voudrais... Est-ce qu'on entend, ça va? Ou bien je dois pousser sur quelque chose? Non, ça va? Ok, d'accord. Je voudrais faire une intervention, enfin un simple complément d'information par rapport à l'exposé qui était fait par Madame Lévesque, qui malheureusement devait s'en aller. C'est pas du tout parce qu'elle craignait ce que j'allais dire, mais elle avait véritablement un rendez-vous auquel elle ne pouvait pas se soustraire. À propos de Balzac, je voulais simplement dire ceci, c'est que bien sûr, il critique toute une série de choses et que le vol commis dans les banques est aussi grave que ceux qu'on commet au coin d'un bois, etc., etc. Mais ce qu'il faut ajouter, c'est que c'est une solution qu'il approuve. Ça paraît peut-être curieux, mais c'est comme ça. Et la preuve que je veux donner à ça, c'est la conclusion d'un roman relativement peu connu qui s'appelle, Madame Lévesque qui a fait une simple allusion, Le cabinet des antiques. Dans le cabinet des antiques, le héros qui là est vraiment un anti-héros. C'est un triste personnage, s'appelle Victurnien des Grignons, et qui commet un faux et une escroquerie. Oui, les deux à la fois d'un même coup. Et il est poursuivi parce qu'il y a évidemment, puisqu'il y a une escroquerie, il y a une victime qui porte plainte. Il est poursuivi. Et alors, il va s'en tirer. Pourquoi? Parce qu'il représente la bonne société de la ville d'Alençon. Il est le type même de la fin de race, mais il a comme tel encore des sympathies, notamment le vieux notaire de la famille, qui est quelqu'un sans enfant et qui voit dans ce rejeton comme le fils qu'il n'a pas eu. Et il est parfaitement au courant des faits, Et alors, il va se mettre en route pour fabriquer de son côté toute une série de preuves en sens inverse. Il va susciter un faux témoignage. Il va en plus corrompre, il n'y a pas d'autre mot, le juge d'instruction chargé de l'affaire. Il obtient grâce à ça un non-lieu. Et après cela, il se répand encore dans toute la ville en calomniant la victime de l'escroquerie. Mais il est déjà très âgé, épuisé par les émotions, ce notaire meurt très peu de temps après. Et alors, ce qu'il y a d'extraordinaire, c'est qu'après tout ce qu'il a fait, et qui est quand même sans excuse, qui tombe évidemment sous le coup de la loi et de la morale la plus élémentaire, on voit Balzac en faire un éloge total. Il y a une demi-page à la fin du Cabinet des Antiques sur l'éloge de ce notaire Chenel, sauf erreur, et sans la moindre réserve, parce qu'on pourrait dire, oui, bah, il a peut-être fait des choses qui n'étaient pas bien, mais enfin, il a, à côté de ça, sauvé l'honneur d'une famille, etc. Bon, donc il n'y a pas la moindre réserve. Et alors je vois là-dedans, personnellement, une approbation totale de l'auteur à ce qu'il faut bien appeler une justice de classe. Voilà un complément d'information que je voulais apporter. Merci.
D'autres questions ? Alors il nous appartient de vous remercier, de remercier tous les intervenants et de remercier le public.